Welcome to Green Priorities, the podcast series dedicated to talking about the green transition. I'm Andrew Prentice, along with my co-host Aidan Clark. In this special episode, we are taking our ideas a step further and considering how we could begin to design or implement a more thoughtful energy grid. We'll talk about the dominance of cost as our information we use to design systems today, and how we might implement other kinds of indicators to bring back the context that's been lost through cost. You join me now with Aidan as we begin this conversation. Welcome to episode 12 of Radical Priorities. Today we thought we would do something a little bit different and we would talk about a practical, maybe a constructive blueprint to start implementing some of the ideas that we have had, along with some of the context for where those ideas will sit and how they might be implemented from where we are today. So starting off thinking about the context in which that we're moving into this episode, what do you think would be important to set the stage so that people will be sort of in the right place to look at the kind of, whether it be policy, technical changes, whatever the ideas are that we come up with today, for those things to fit?
The basic political challenge is, if we come up with a really good idea, like practically, how do you finance it? How do you practically implement it? Who are the actors? And there's a bigger conversation to be had about what major roadblocks there might be. I mean, if whether it's in the global economy, whether it's the Canadian economy, whether it's Ontario's economy, and an economy they're capturing maybe more than what we mean by economics. Also, again, our infrastructure, our work, our day-to-day lifestyles, our consumption habits, etc. So hopefully with whatever practical details we have to work with, we can also contextualize the kind of political event of installing such a practical project.
Definitely. So when I was sort of doing the research for this video, we were kind of chatting about which of our various ideas that we'd talked about in the past we were going to do, and we'd picked energy grids because it was something that we felt we'd really gotten to really well examined at the time, and that was something that we could maybe actually look into practically working with a little bit more. So part of the major thing I was sort of researching before this, I was looking into different industries and where they are for us relative to energy sources that we have today in Ontario. So from a local perspective, I think probably a province is probably about the right scale to start thinking about things, maybe, because it's a little bit bigger. It allows for a little bit wider context than maybe at like a municipal level, but not such a huge scale as a federal idea or policy. Whether we look at, for instance, in this case, power grids for the capacity that they have to sort of go, the demand to go up and down in our grids, or the supply to go up and down. Looking at basically, okay, well, how do we take that last bit of, say, natural gas that we presently use, as we talked about in episode 3, that sort of moderates the flow of electricity, that allows it to stay balanced, say within, synchronous within sort of demand and supply. How do we then, for instance, take a factory and have it produce slightly fewer beer bottles or slightly fewer cars in a day, in order to balance the grid um, instead of generating extra energy with fossil fuels? And as we go forward and start to add more renewable energy to our grid, to start to think about, if there's going to be larger fluctuations, we produce more one day and less the next than we would have, rather than just sort of a set amount, which is sort of how we currently do things. And we have to think about, I was thinking about sort of what kind of policy vehicle or what kind of partnerships would be required in order to come up with a functional system in that regard.
So could you help us understand functionality? I mean, some of the terms there, we've got power, and we've got things like factories, which seem to be the obvious practical players, the major, say, industrial players in a serious public energy grid. And then we've got balance, which is probably the goal, in a sense, of the system. But help us understand this umbrella of functionality.
So in this case, we'd be talking about sort of a rehabilitation of workers and industry's relationship to the energy sources that we have in nature. So whether that be sunlight or wind, in the case of renewables, but also in the case of the current setup that we have, where we have a grid which, say for instance, has a dramatically more demand during the day than it does during the night, because our electricity is drawn by houses during the day and by commercial stuff and everything else that we have running. So to think about, okay, for instance, if you had um, a factory, yeah, that has, say, large heaters in it because they're manufacturing chemicals, say, and it takes quite a lot of energy to do that. They might run a 24-hour shift, right, where they have people there all the time and they're running their heaters and creating the chemicals, whatever they're doing. Independently of that, we might have more or less energy on the grid or more or less demand on the grid for that energy. And so what it means is sort of basically that total that we're coming up to and that balance that we have to be in between the supply of energy and the demand for it has to be perfect. And right now what we do is we basically use a little bit of extra grid power. We generate more power to make up for it on the grid. And on days that we don't have as much demand, we actually curtail our generation and we generate less power. Um, so ideally, what we would do is we would just use more energy on days where we have more energy and use less on days that we have less. And so it would mean, yeah, industry being more flexible, but also people's times being more flexible, um, possibly people living closer to work, things like that.
And this falls under the umbrella of rehabilitation. And I mean, already there's this concept of changing, at least making people more aware of their work, having more agency in the context of what they're working on, because presumably I can't see a context in which people are going to be talking about changing, say, the setup of industry without at the same time talking about what the industry is producing. And the same would go for obviously workers within industry. That and to what extent are they empowered to do so? And what kind of decisions do they have in front of them, and how do they make those decisions? And maybe this gets at some of the sort of the questions around policy or implementation. Another thing that strikes me is, and it's something obviously we spoke about during the main sort of energy grid episode when we looked at that in the context of Canada, is seasonality, but also night and day, and there's this interest in materialities and in textures that seem to come very much outside of the scope and context of what I would call kind of like productive economic paradigms. Like it's nothing to do with yields or specific mechanical industrial markers of production, even if it's still an industrial system. Introducing these variables, which are typically called externalities, of course, in economics, might just come a little bit at the expense of economics itself, which obviously puts the question once more, well, what is the... It seems as if one can't avoid facing that the whole of society's purpose itself has to kind of be civilizationally confronted. And you can maybe do it very moderately. But maybe this is something we underestimated when we were looking at energy grids earlier, in that, again, it's one thing to try and describe it technically, but it seems like the really important details are not just in what's possible in terms of sort of the balancing act that you've described before and the fragility of the grids, but obviously also in terms of what the grid is being used for and how that utterly contextualizes the grid itself as a social, public piece of infrastructure.
Yeah, and we might think about, for instance, yeah, what the people who are working there, what are they going to want out of what they're making, like in the past we had, I think, maybe a really direct route for people. If you made something, you made it for the people who lived right next to you, like you lived in a small place and everyone did something, and it was very easy to, I think, have that context. But when you're, say, a guy that works in Sarnia who makes petrochemicals for Ontario, it's very opaque. And I think we can't quite rely in the same way on community to be the reason that people, uh, go to want to work and want to participate. Um, I mean, I would hope that we'll have a renewed emphasis on community, maybe one now that involves a more digital community too. Like that might be, again, if you're connected to your family across the world over the internet, you know what part you play in that system. Um, but there's all kinds of pieces that we could take apart slowly that we could start with. I think the energy grid's a good one because it connects them all, and a lot of it is currently publicly held, which is also quite crucial, I think, in looking at like actually adapting a public system.
So how does the energy grid? I mean, just look in terms of its construction, the numbers behind it. Again, looking within the context of a province, how does a public grid like this already help us think about ways that we could transition towards, again, whether it's greater agency in industry or industrial workers themselves, also agency on the consumption side, the households. You mentioned the connectivity. Absolutely, we're at an intensely global and hyper-tech world. The grid plays an absolutely essential role in that. How does the grid already encourage maybe a different paradigms of engagement and implementation?
So back to the classic little phrase I like to use. It's really is like it's an everything anywhere all at once kind of technology, in that it actually offers no context. When you plug anything into an outlet anywhere, you get power from who knows where that comes to you and is converted into some other kind of power without really much thought to the efficiency of that power, where it's coming from, who helped to generate it and why. All of those things are sort of thrown to the wind, which I think people probably see that as quite a liberating quality of our power grid, that we have access to this all the time everywhere. Um, but it also means that we not only do we have some dramatic uh, far off consequences because of this, whether it be, again, environmental collapse, or whether it be the various social problems that come with that kind of infrastructure, the financial system that underpins it, all of those different things. Um, but but I think it also really, in people's lives, it means that they really don't understand. They just can't conceptualize and understand um, what it means to use energy in any context, and certainly not in the items that they might hold in their hand. When you pick up a laptop, you can't look at it and think, oh, this is how much, how many swings of the blacksmith's hammer made this. You have no idea when you pick something like that up. And I think that
I love,
reintroducing
yeah,
that is the key.
definitely. And how do you construct a system that has, say, the information about the swings, how many swings of the blacksmith's hammer? Of course, some would argue that market society is that system. It's the ultimate information society. Before we had the information age in the context of computers and modern technology, we have had the information age of markets, which is like, well, but we have a coordination system for the amount of strikes and the cost of the materials and the cost of transportation. But you notice that word cost over determines everything. It's not quite the same thing as 3 swings or 4 swings of the blacksmith hammer, which also shouldn't necessarily be reduced. Well, okay, how much energy does this blacksmith expend, and how many calories does he need a day to do this? This is also, I think, returning to a very similar kind of information that markets already prioritize. In fact, that's a rather good way of imagining what markets or economics itself kind of is. It's concerned with this kind of information, whether it's calories, whether it's cost, in which you can think about things in terms of quantities and inputs and outputs, and it is in and of itself a decontextualized description of reality, and that's a very good way of understanding why it's been so successful at industrializing and sort of moving beyond all the normal paradigms of nature and even society. But you mentioned finance earlier. I mean, a good way of thinking about it is that the grid exists for the financial system, not the other way around. And it's more from the financial system that we get this concept of power everywhere, all the time, and as much as I want. Because there's one system in particular in our society that needs this concept of power, and it's markets as a whole, but in particular it's finance. It's finance is a sort of layer above everything that makes sure everything is happening, right? It's the grease that keeps the wheels of markets turning. If you don't have the money for the investments, for the initial startup capital, to pay the workers, whatever it is, nothing gets started. And so finance has to keep its hands on all of these different operations. And the death of finance is when there's any interruption to the flow of money, right? To the flow of capital, the flow of investment. So again, the metaphor here has very little to do with the flow of energy, which might seem like the obvious reference, and a lot more to do with the flow of capital. So maybe the obvious question is then, okay, or the obvious challenge is we have to concretely change this grid to do this different kind of, we have to adapt it, obviously for different uses, different expectations around energy. But it's striking that I wonder if whatever this would be practically, but decoupling from financial metaphors, from monetary metaphors, as it were, of consumption and supply might actually be a rather good way of reimagining, let's say, the social design of a public energy grid.
Yeah, and thinking about looking to like the governments that own and operate most of that equipment, obviously they are of the exact same beast. They're sort of the other head, if it, of that mechanism. So I think it's a really challenging thing to sort of reimagine governments as not, deeply involved with financial markets. I do think that there's a lot of ire for them both right now. Um, and I think that maybe within that context, it's quite a good time to reimagine some of the ways that we evaluate efficiency or evaluate uh, yield or cost or any of the things that we hold, really uh, near and dear, particularly as it holds to the context of cost of living and food, whether it be food or housing or transportation. Even energy today is something that people talk about as as being expensive. So I think that not only reevaluating and then allowing that reevaluation to allow us to make real actual gains in efficiency, that you will actually be able to see in reflected in a better quality of life for people generally. Uh, and whether that means, more accessible food, I won't use the word cheaper, but more accessible food or housing, or housing and food that's less environmentally destructive, less isolated, less, all the things that we're really trying to solve here that are maybe not reflected very well in price or cost by our current system. Um, and maybe that's one of the reasons why something like our Canadian carbon tax failed so heavily is because it didn't actually, it tried to add those things into cost, but maybe price generally just wasn't a very good concept for evaluating those things.
Definitely. And cost is the wrong, or cheapness is the wrong concept. We spoke in a number of the episodes about infrastructure and energy, about the difference between material efficiency versus financial efficiency. And financial efficiency, again, is where we get this metaphor of really anywhere, all the time, and as much as we want. Whereas material efficiency obviously is completely different. It doesn't even, those words don't even make sense. I mean, unless you're talking about some absolute Newtonian time, space time. And even that's not a good description of the natural world or of reality, as we've long realized since Einstein. So markets are themselves structured in terms of logics of absolute space-time. It's when you break down the mathematics of them, those are the assumptions they make about buyers and sellers and the nature of access. And you can always add complications and dynamics that make it seem more real. But on the whole, our love of markets and our attachment to them and comes from an attachment to this paradigm of financial efficiency. And cheapness is kind of the golden standard we imagine. Cheapness is both in absolute and relative terms. Absolute in that, like, we want to be getting the best bang for our buck, but relative in terms of, like, well, if I'm going in and I'm a firm and I'm making something, I show my understanding of materials and so on through getting a better cost than my competitor, right? Because I can make it cheaper, I have more efficient materials or methods, what have you. And it's funny that, in a sense, when you actually go look into markets, what we have in our market society, you actually see endless emphasis actually on certain kinds of material efficiencies, but they're siloed off into these contexts of competition that ultimately overdetermine the products themselves, the society of products. Even, again, the word product itself is like a terrible misnomer. It's a way of talking about an object in reality in this kind of financially efficient way, again, decontextualizing it, which I think leads to a question I wanted to ask you, which is the big question maybe of the episode. But how do you design, again, a grid that takes into consideration the three strikes of the blacksmith's hammer, and more importantly, what is the concept of that grid of those strikes of the hammer if it's not just another piece of decontextualized information? For instance, like what is a materially efficient view of the three strikes of the hammer, for instance?
For one thing, it has to be a lot more holistic. So if we think about, for instance, a lot of if you think about the cheapness of something today, the way that we evaluate whether that's cheap, inexpensive could be a fine word to use were it properly contextualized. It just isn't. So, for instance, we have lost a lot of our ability because of competitiveness. Again, like you say, different efficiencies being siloed off. Competitiveness is what leads to the cheapest chair wins because that's what one person in one context will buy. The $10 plastic chair that falls apart in a year. But the chair that costs 5 times as much but will last you 100 years doesn't get built anymore. So part of the context, I think, is a much more holistic approach, both looking at the whole system as a whole. Where's that chair going to be, and is it adaptable to its, whatever else we're going to be doing with it, but also how far into the future is this thing going to matter, kind of thing. And right now we're very, very short thinking, I think, in a lot of our different contexts. Even so far as we think about things, sort of at a bigger scale, whether that be, for instance, in the context of this episode, you're thinking about uh, a brewery that's brewing beer and they have to keep the beer warm. Well, they could, rather than having another power plant, we could insulate the tank. That's an easy example of something that we could be doing. That the beer place won't necessarily come to itself because it's more expensive for them, and the public utility that's providing them the energy to heat this tank isn't going to go walk in there because it's not their stuff. They're not going to walk in and insulate that tank. But at the end of the day, actually, both parties would be way better off if they did. And I think that communication breakdown is so critical here. And it's something that we used to have to do because we didn't really have a choice. If we didn't reuse the tails of the effort that come out of the bakery in the brewery next door to make the beer, we couldn't have afforded to make beer. But nowadays, not only because we have excessive amounts of, say, really cheap energy, but also cheap money we've had for such a long time, we've actually forgotten how to connect those two things, connect lots of things together. And that's where, again, I think that the grid is a really good example of, like, it's a public utility that already exists that actually interconnects tons and tons of things. And it's an opportunity to start really thinking a lot more cross-sectionally, if that makes sense, between a public power utility and a consumer, and also between the people who are making the products, kind of thing, or the chemicals. And again, other industrial suppliers in there that are getting something from someone else and then moving it around, as it pertains to transport. But the grid really is the thing that connects it all, I think.
The interest is to sort of introduce the context back into the system, which the system currently lacks. And I suppose one of the challenges of industrial society, especially as it becomes maybe to an extent post-industrial, though maybe that's an illusion of its own, is, well, what are the guarantees, in a way, for context? I mean, think about the guarantees that might have existed between the bakers and the brewers, in communities and cultures that do not exist, and if they do, not in the way they did. And I mean, culture is a word that is used both in the study of society and also in biology, obviously, and in foodstuffs. And it's like, it takes time to get a culture. and it requires complexity and certain dynamics that we've definitely asphyxiated in a sense out of existence. Um, because of things like, again, cheap money is a great example. I mean, there's been ridiculous amounts of cheap money and a sort of thoughtlessness around cheap money that now that it's sort of blown up in our faces, and the major central banks of the world, one, have declared, okay, the era of cheap money or free money is over, which is a declaration of the Federal Reserve of the United States, or just generally their incapacity to basically figure out the state of the economy right now. And there are bigger reasons for why that's the case, but it absolutely comes back to this problem, this problem of context and this problem of how do you try and get a quote unquote gain in efficiency when you've actually sacrificed the world of efficiency gains themselves, which largely got us to this point. Well, your efficiency gains become so abstract because they're not connected to, as you say, sort of linking one part of society with another. You'd think that that would be the ultimate example of efficiency. And the example you give of to what political right does, a municipality or whoever's, organizing a public grid, say the scale of a province. I mean, going into a private business and trying to say, in intervening in the affairs of business. I mean, this is one of the axioms of modern economic and legal society. You don't do this. And of course, there are societies that do. China is obvious, and increasingly Trump. Right? So this politics is coming back. In fact, I would argue that Doug Ford is engaging in this kind of politics right now. The problem is that many of them are unwilling to accept that this thing called market society or capitalism or economics generally is in this disaster because it's unable to generate the material on which hundreds of years of industrial gains were based. Even as we've made a bunch of new things and created a bunch of new contexts, cities and consumerism and so on, we've kind of run out of material, it almost seems like sometimes. And the cheapness of global material is the ultimate sort of symptom of this in a way. We can produce enormous amounts of cheap material. We've now reached the point where even that system's too expensive to sustain. Literally, the economics of globalism doesn't work anymore. And we're at a crossroads where we either say we're going to figure out how to re-inject a bunch of materiality into literally human society, or we're going to have to keep paying to keep this fiction or fantasy of efficiency alive. And, again, with it, fictions around, well, we can lower cost of living if we have a more globalized system. Bear in mind, that's basically the alternative that many people have come in against Trump or Doug Ford or China, or, not that these are our world's greatest role models, but there's an undeniable edge to their politics that at least fairly reflects the catastrophe I think that we're in, at least as far as our sort of larger systems of management. And so lowering cost of living it won't work if maybe the concept of cost, as we've already said, itself is what needs to be rethought. But the challenge is, how do you introduce that context? How do you get context back? And it seems to me the question is a little bit the answer, talking about a public energy grid in and of itself, doing maybe some of the obvious things of well, do we have a right to talk about public infrastructure? Are we able to explore all of the material options or not? That seems to be a rather important point in and of itself.
Well, really connecting sort of some of those strands, I think that as we connect them, more connections will just sort of organically appear and people will start to see the picture. I kind of wonder if, again, starting to connect, say, the grid or our transportation systems, these major connective industries, um, and infrastructures, maybe starting to connect those things will allow other things to start to pop out, basically. And I think we'll sort of figure out the context as we go. But as it pertains to getting there, that is the big question, right? How do you how do you start to reintroduce context for the first time into any of these into infrastructural pieces or industries? You know, I kind of again that's one of the reasons I like the power grid and to some extent transportation as sort of the first couple things you start to look at because they're largely publicly held. They are, actually already quite subsidized. They're already handled by, one larger organization, but that are forced actually through maybe arduous routes and sort of a bit opaque routes, but they are actually connected in a lot of different ways to different people. Um, and I wonder about those, yeah, again, if we take that the little bit of context that's there, whether that could be something that's grown as well.
I think so. I think the power, in a sense, and no pun intended, in the political power, obviously, of this public grid, it like maybe cannot be underestimated. And it's an old paradigm, at least again in industrialized society, that a political action can strike at the sort of lifeblood, say, of industrial production. Say, okay, well, we're not going to supply, or we're not going to supply in the way that you want, unless you start to make concessions. I think that there's a reason why this politics has both succeeded and failed. It succeeded in establishing, things like social security and universal health care and literacy rates and so on. But it also failed maybe in that it was nonetheless pushing the system forward with without coming up with obviously an alternative, and mainly because, for instance, the battle between a nation state and industrialists, industrial power. Nation states emerged as a result of industrial power. The modern nation, the modern nationalization movements of the 19th century continental Europe, whatever their references are to their medieval versions, let's be precise, like they emerged because of massive urbanizing classes of people. Again, urbanization began hundreds of years earlier. People, the changes of the feudal lifestyle began hundreds of years earlier. But so in that sense, obviously, it's very difficult for an industrialized state to sort of risk refuting itself and refuting, again, like the basic contract that it offers, say, every worker, every citizen, which is, we're not actually going to turn the power off. We actually do want industry. This is the wealth of our society. And, it's a question we have confronted to some extent in the past, like, okay, well, you have a bunch of wealth, but you can't do anything with it. And how do we define the wealth in a public grid versus the wealth in monetary terms of all the different parts of a society, say what the government owns or the global economy as a whole, its private and public parts? It's a very messy picture. And I think the only way to sort of render it less messy is to say, okay, well, the society that we're building with all of this power is probably something we should be debating. And this is where the consumption side comes in, as opposed to just striking at the supply to industry, right? Is, well, what about the people who are using all of this power on the consumption end in household contexts? And rather than this trying to re-emphasize the role of the individual over corporate responsibility, I think the point is more to say, what is the society that we're trying to design here? To me, part of the politics that we're trying to generate here, the politics is the picture. What you mentioned earlier with connecting different pieces of infrastructure. Well, yeah, the better that picture can be, probably the stronger the political message is. And whether it's a simple question of advertising those connections or figuring them out or experimenting with those connections, or maybe in the widest sense saying, okay, in the context of government, what options do you have to impose the beginnings, at least, of a different energy contract? You sort of maybe call it that. Can we have a different energy contract? What are the basic conditions? But you would absolutely have to change from the beginning the concepts of consumption. And of course, consumption and industrial production go hand in hand. So in a sense, you kind of, in striking one, you strike the other.
Yeah, and whether we think about sort of the economic zones that Ford's been talking about, or whether that would apply as well, maybe to people who would be interested in moving to or moving around within sort of maybe more interesting contexts of where and which and how you would live. So it's hard to, whether we would break up society or again into smaller chunks that could experiment with different things, or whether we would try as a whole to change what we're doing, I think is an interesting question too. Like I know we talked about like special development zones municipally once, but yeah, the idea of like again, could you build a neighborhood that actually had some of the parts of integrated that had actually the swings of the hammer that you could still see a little bit. Um, and out of those things, you'd find actually those extremely local um, problem solving, skills could be then applied to larger problems and interconnections between more local answers. Whether that be in the context of like a neighborhood or in the context of, for instance, where we have a lot of hydropower and putting power, factories next to it kind of thing. And introducing new context between those two because now all of a sudden it's cheaper to get stuff there, it's cheaper to get energy there, whatever it might be that we're using in that context, but just slowly sort of picking out some zones and saying, okay, well, we're going to maybe start doing some different things there. Not unlike, again, when China moved to capitalism, they opened up a couple of areas and they said, we're going to keep our present system, but we're going to sort of add some new things in.
What industrialization also we choose to continue to do will be important for figuring out what the kind of material sensibility or sensicality of a region where you are still doing industry. It is this thing we've spoken about in the past as kind of seasonal industry. It's got all of these various regional conditions as well in terms of like the alignment between what's being produced and the environment around it. Yeah, I mean, it's funny that one would use a concept of Doug Ford again in its opposite to its purpose, to its chosen purpose, which was to create zones which would accelerate economic activity. But I think the truth is, Ford has created the ultimate fiction in the best sense, in which one can imagine not supercharging economic activity, but activity itself. And I don't think we can rely upon some naive idea of what activity means. And this gets to the heart of industry and consumption. Like, what are we building? What are we actually making? And there are probably things that we could easily say, well, we want chairs, we want maybe dryers, and we want window panes. And, there are things there, but, the concepts that we embed into those objects make all the difference. Whether it's the 100-year-old chair that's still around, made, in the early 19th century in Quebec when, it was a big thing, because it was sort of peacetime conditions and people actually had money. And in peacetime, artisans have time to make very beautiful, ornate, and durable designs. Or it's the plastic chair from Walmart, And those differences are everything. So we're not talking about two chairs. There's anyone who's interested in Japanese architecture will know that often the challenge in Japan is to try and fit a lot into very small spaces. And this is kind of it's both a regional constraint and a social constraint, obviously. I mean, they have a very particular urban society. And a relatively small island. Obviously, people could live a lot more spread out, but they do live in these massive commercial hubs like Tokyo. And so some architects, have designed certain houses which are almost like one giant room. And they're very strange because they're basically open concept, but they have levels. But each room speaks to each other room. And and it's funny when you go and look at these, you see, okay, well, they've got the kitchen and they've got the place to do the washing up and they've got the bed. And we often don't look at our houses in this way, for instance, in the West, because they're all broken up by walls and yet the concept of the house itself is a concept of a self-sufficient person, right? Who can do everything within their unit. And again, going back to the very beginning of this conversation, we didn't just stumble upon that idea because it's such a nice, pleasant idea and how useful it is. I would argue, in fact, there are many reasons why that's not useful. You know, why it indulges bad forms of consumption, why it indulges and forces upon us a cheap system of global materials, right? Because the moment that each person is living in that unit and there's no cross communication, what kind of quality of infrastructure do you think you have, or quality of furniture, or quality of anything? You can look, right, as we've been doing throughout these episodes, looking at agriculture, looking at energy, looking at infrastructure, trying to show that materiality matters, but it's not something you can just sort of refer to in an advertisement. It has to be lived, otherwise it basically doesn't really exist.
Yeah, and I think that's again the unit of the family home, or even an apartment is a great example of that. Again, like everyone needs their own kitchen, then everyone has their own bathroom, everyone has these communal spaces to spend time in too. And also everyone's dealing with isolation, everyone's dealing with, you know, it's inputs and outputs that we're finding that are just so disjointed. Um, so in the context of looking towards, again, a reformed a grid, or a reform, any kind of reform that we look at practically, maybe one of the first things we have to do is evaluate how people want to live, and where people want to live, and like you say, what kinds of chairs we want, and what kinds of of even like what kinds of computers we want, and then we can think about how we then ascribe that to the various industries that we're going to need to be able to produce those things, and as we're thinking about these things, we can actually have a conversation with ourselves about, well, what does it mean for our context with the greater environment, but also between nations, and between communities, whether that be here in Canada or around the world. Um, yeah, and I think looking at some of our most intimately and leftover connected infrastructure that we have, like the power grid, like the road network, that already are that are quite mired in regulation, because they're this thing that's really, it is actually connected. Fundamentally, there's no way to remove that connection. It can't be removed, no matter how hard we try, and maybe trying to unbury some of that context and take that forward. That was our first Blueprint episode, trying to dive deeper into some of our past episode themes. As we continue to make more progress in our thinking, we will record Blueprint episodes on all the topics that we cover. This has been Green Priorities. Thank you for listening.